right, thanks for coming to my talk today at Percona Live Online 2021. Today we're going to talk about Percona Server for MongoDB versus MongoDB Enterprise Advanced. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Barrett Chambers. I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer at Percona. Part of my job is to speak to potential customers and customers about their goals in the open source software space. Today specifically, we're going to be focusing on MongoDB, and I think a lot of times the decision is between MongoDB Enterprise Advanced versus Percona Server, as well as the tools and ecosystem surrounding the core server itself. A lot of times people aren't considering MongoDB community versus Percona Server for MongoDB, and a lot of information out there compares those two and doesn't focus a lot on the enterprise software. So I'm going to spend my time today focusing specifically on enterprise versus Percona Server. The important thing to keep in mind as we're going through this is that the Percona side is completely free and open source. The MongoDB side, most of the software I'm going to be discussing is licensed or subscription based. So just keep that in mind as we're going through. I do highlight that on a few slides, but I'm not hammering it on every single slide. So try to keep that in mind. Here's the agenda for today. The first thing we're going to discuss is the companies themselves that produce the software. That's important when making a decision between software companies. We're kind of going in different directions. Percona is going a free and open source route. MongoDB is going into a subscription license-based route. And second, we're going to go through the Percona Server for MongoDB build process. I'll show you how we build it and why you should feel confident running it in production. Sometimes we get questions about how that build process works, so I've kind of outlined that in a little more detail. And then the meat of the presentation is going to be MongoDB Enterprise Advanced versus Percona Server for MongoDB features. We're going to go through the ones that I feel are most important, the ones that I talk about most when I'm speaking to customers and potential customers about their potential requirements and whether the software is a fit or not. So I'm going to go through essentially that checklist that I'm in my head or via conversations going through to figure out if it's going to be a good fit. And then the final one is cost consideration. So I'm going to show what it costs to run Percona software on AWS versus what it would cost to run MongoDB software on Atlas and AWS. So to kick it off, comparing just the companies, we've got Percona LLC and MongoDB Inc. They've both been around for a while. Percona was founded in 2006 by Peter Zaitsev and Vadim Tichenko. They were focused on high-performance open source MySQL software initially, and you'll see that in 2006 we're releasing Percona Server for MySQL. That was our first software release. A year later, MongoDB, actually it started out as 10gen, so 10gen Software was founded, and they developed MongoDB as a backend platform for their platform as a service that they were planning on offering to customers. A couple years later, they open sourced MongoDB to try to drive adoption and get help from the community in developing it. Around that same time, Percona is continuing its focus on open source software within the MySQL space and open source alternative to Oracle's toolkit on that MySQL side. So we've released Extra Backup and Percona Toolkit. And then 10gen decides MongoDB is taking off. There's a lot of adoption. People are using it for their production workloads. They want to focus their entire business around developing MongoDB. So they changed their name to MongoDB Inc. And then, Percona's customers notice this increasing adoption. Percona notices this increased adoption, as well as kind of our core philosophy of offering open source software where no alternatives exist. MongoDB releases Ops Manager, which is subscription software. So currently, MongoDB's offering MongoDB, which is open source software, but to run it, they're recommending Ops Manager. So going the open source route, customer and community pressure, Percona acquires Tokutech, which had a fractal tree storage engine fork of MongoDB community. And through that acquisition, Percona was able to develop Percona Server for MongoDB. So this is all happening, six years ago. Getting more recent in developments, Percona monitoring and management was a huge push for us. There weren't many open source monitoring options in the marketplace. There were a lot of proprietary marketplace options, which our customers were using. Around the same time, MongoDB has a huge Atlas push, pushing people to cloud automation, as well as Compass, which is a GUI tool that provides developers with a way to interact with documents in real time. MongoDB also goes public on NASDAQ. They're getting all sorts of cash flow investors, hiring aggressively, continuing to develop more tools and develop the MongoDB software as well. There's major releases for MongoDB Enterprise and Community as well. They acquired MLab, which was a competitor in the database as a service space. And around that same time, they switched their license to SSPL. And what that SSPL did is it prevented prevented other companies from taking MongoDB software and offering it as a service to its users unless they open source the entire platform. This was interpreted sort of as a direct attack or backlash to Google Cloud or Amazon or Azure for taking open source software like MySQL and offering it as a service to customers, and the upstream vendor not really having any control over that. So MongoDB wanted to stop that. They put the SSPL in, and that sort of shut that down. DynamoDB from Amazon is based on an older fork that has the AGPL version, so they didn't have to deal with that SSPL license. So Percona, on the tooling side, released Percona Backup for MongoDB, Percona Kubernetes Operator for Percona Server for MongoDB, which helped with automation for Kubernetes-based workloads, as well as a distribution for MongoDB, which packages all the tools so that it's easy for customers to run proper versioning between all the tools that we've been releasing within the ecosystem. On the MongoDB side, they released their Enterprise Kubernetes Operator, which utilize Ops Manager for the automation component, and then Realm for app development for mobile apps and using MongoDB as a backend for that. You'll notice in this slide I do have asterisks next to what you would have to pay a subscription or license for on the MongoDB side. There's none of that on the Percona side, so I'm trying to call that out. You'll notice Compass is open source, so that is a tool that anyone can use. And while I was doing this, I thought, what are Percona and MongoDB talking about right now? So I formed these word clouds based on just the landing page for Percona, specifically the MongoDB section of Percona's website, and then MongoDB's landing page of the website. And there's a lot of similarities, obviously database. One thing that was interesting to me is learn. Both companies want to help their customers and potential customers learn to use their software and implement it properly. And then one thing I noticed on the Mongo side is you'll notice that their tools and add-ons and subscription services are popping out. You'll see Atlas and Charts and Compass on there and Realm. So they're definitely beefing up their focus on that side of their business. And then further on those websites, Percona is saying, what are we saying now? We just went through a history, 10 plus years. What are we saying now? Percona is saying, we've been keeping open source open for 15 years. We want anyone, anywhere, to have free access to the software and tools necessary to turn their ideas into a viable business. On the Mongo side, they believe in empowerment. We believe in making data easy to work with, which gives people the opportunity to free their genius and create something world-changing. So they're very much empowering, still back to their roots, empowering developers and now empowering other members of businesses like data scientists with their tool set. So now that we've gone through a history, let's go through the Percona Server for MongoDB build process. A lot of times I get asked how we build our software. Is it truly compatible? How are we getting fixes for Mongo? And hopefully this series of slides will address that. So every time we're releasing Percona Server for MongoDB, we're pulling down the community version. This means we're getting patches that MongoDB Inc. has released in the community version. And then we're taking that and adding on bug fixes reported from our customers, whether that's performance or actual bug related causing outages. We'll add that to our version. And then we'll add scalability enhancements. So one example of this is the in-memory storage engine that we've added for workloads that can be kept entirely in memory, that can potentially boost performance of your MongoDB workloads if you're able to offload that work set. Number 4, enterprise features. When I think of the enterprise features we're adding, I think of mostly security-related add-ons, which make people comfortable using our software in production because it's got the encryption and data auditing, that type of stuff. And then the last couple of steps are us adding community features. So before WiredTiger was acquired by MongoDB, they had a hot backup built into their storage engine. We've added that to Percona Server for MongoDB. And we'll go over that a little more when I get into the feature comparison slides. The final step is our QA. So Percona has internal development and QA team, and they rigorously test before every release our software. So it goes through each of these steps every time there's a community version released for Mongo. All right, enterprise features. Let's get into kind of the meat of this presentation and go over enterprise features. I've tried to pull out the important ones to discuss, and I'm trying to be unbiased and highlight gaps that exist in Percona software as well as gaps that might exist in the Mongo software. It's really difficult to look at MongoDB's software and see which components could potentially be enterprise only or community. It's kind of hidden in the documentation. There'll be one line at the top of the page that says, this feature is enterprise only. So we try to do a good job of informing the community of what you would potentially give up or get from MongoDB Enterprise. So from a security perspective, there's not many gaps. We've got LDAP authentication, LDAP authorization. We've got Kerberos available. User audit logging is available in Percona Server for MongoDB. So this is tracking user activity for auditing purposes. This is really important for PCI compliant or HIPAA compliant customers. We have X509 authentication, and we have log redaction, which is also important for PCI compliant to strip credit card numbers or something from log files. The final one that is missing on the Percona Server side is SNMP. So if you need that functionality for some sort of alerting, something like that, that's not available in Percona Server for MongoDB if you're using it in the Enterprise Advanced side. So that would be a consideration. Do we actually need this? Can we find a different way of doing this? Or do we need to stick with MongoDB Enterprise? There's a few other security considerations that I didn't list here because they're available in the community version, but they're worth mentioning. So I created this slide to call them out. So role-based access control is a big one. This is assigning roles to user groups. This is by default. It's been in MongoDB for a while. There are out-of-the-box roles that you can assign to users, but you can also define roles. So give them a specific set of permissions that they're able to execute on those MongoDB servers. The next one is encryption in flight. That's available by default with Community Enterprise or Percona Server for MongoDB. So you can have your SSL connections between nodes and between the application with just the community version. The final one is schema validation. This is also available in just the community version, as well as all other versions. But this allows you to rigidly enforce schema design within Mongo. Originally, when MongoDB was released, it was touted as kind of the NoSQL. You don't need to rigidly define schemas. You don't need to do alters. But sometimes that's important if you have developers that like to just add extra information, for example, and you don't want to do that. So you could limit, we're only collecting this information in this collection. You're not allowed to add birth date, social security number, whatever you want to a document that's being stored in the collection. So this is important from a security and compliance perspective as well. So then the next enterprise feature we're going to discuss is storage engines. And sometimes I get asked about this. What's the difference in performance or storage engines between MongoDB Enterprise and Percona Server for MongoDB? Usually the answer to that is there's no difference really. The WiredTiger storage engine is the same, so you'll get that in both versions. WiredTiger Hot Backup is open source. It is available in the community. And I did find documentation on MongoDB's website about taking hot backups, but I couldn't find any methods for taking a hot backup when I was looking into it. So that's why there's a yellow checkbox there. Percona Server MongoDB's documentation does have that documentation, so that's why that is a green check. But I have a feeling that this functionality does work. MongoDB just maybe prefers you to use a different backup method. The next one is wired tiger encryption. Transparent data encryption at the database level, TDE, is becoming more popular among organizations to encrypt their data. So in recent versions of Percona Server for MongoDB and MongoDB Enterprise, this feature has been added. And there are a little more components to that that you need for it to work properly that we're going to get into on the next page. And there are some gaps that exist on the Percona Server side, so we'll talk about that. The final one, enterprise feature related to storage engines, is the in-memory engine, which is enterprise-only feature on the MongoDB side, but is available in the open source version of Percona Server for MongoDB. So as I said, getting further into that wired tiger encryption, there's a few limitations if you do choose to use this on the Percona Server side that don't exist on the enterprise version. So local key storage is supported on both. However, both companies, Percona and MongoDB, say don't use this in production. This is good for testing the functionality, but you don't want to store local keys. It's not as secure as using a key management system. So Percona has integrated with HashiCorp Vault as the key management solution. This is available open source. They do have an enterprise version as well, but you can, fully run this with the open source version. MongoDB has shifted recently their messaging to encouraging their users to use KMIP protocol for that key storage with an enterprise proprietary key management or security system that is compatible with that protocol. They have a lot of partners listed on their website that provide commercial solutions to fill this gap. Percona hasn't gone that route because it's proprietary and commercial, so we want to give our users an option for open source. However, if there's increasing community pressure or customer pressure to enable this, then we would consider it. So if this is something that your company says, hey, we need the solution to have this, I would appreciate hearing about that. The next one is AWS KMS. We haven't integrated with that as well. Sort of similar logic to the not doing the KMIP protocol. On the client-side field level encryption, this is a new feature that was added recently to MongoDB. It is only available on the Enterprise Advanced version, but this allows you to encrypt specific fields at the client level with MongoDB. So there's some limitations that might be missing or unclear from documentation that I've kind of pulled out and highlighted here. All right, so next enterprise feature, or feature that people consider necessary for running enterprise-grade MongoDB solutions, which I agree with, is backups. So Percona, as if you remember back to that timeline slide, we've developed Percona Backup for MongoDB, which is a robust automated backup solution. The reason that I've given us a yellow check mark instead of a green check mark is that it's not completely automated. The logic for taking the backup is, but it's still command line driven. You have to go to the command line agent, execute a backup, and then our automation kicks in. We decide which secondary to take the backup on. If it's a sharded cluster, we ensure that that backup is shard consistent when we're storing to the remote backup solution. So a lot of the automation is built in for you, but it's still not wholly automated like an Atlas, for example. You can just click a button and the backup's going. But all the other features that you would expect from a backup solution should be available. So we do have sharded cluster consistent point-in-time recovery, incremental backups, cloud backups, snapshotting, wired tiger hot backup, and you can stream to a remote backup storage like S3. And I wanted to give, there's probably another talk that goes way deeper into this, but I wanted to give a high level of what I'm talking about in terms of, it's half automated. So from a backup perspective, you would be interacting with the PBM command line in the top right, and that's responsible for understanding, the cluster consistency of that backup and streaming it to the remote backup storage. So the actual backup portion is automated, but you still need to issue the proper command at the command line level, and you can script that and get creative with it, but it's not as out of the box automated as the Atlas version. So the next enterprise feature that's important is monitoring. Percona has spent a lot of effort on Percona monitoring management. So we're comparing here MongoDB Enterprise Advanced with Atlas versus Percona Server for MongoDB with Percona monitoring and management. So you will get query analytics with both. One thing that is a gap that I had identified by kind of, again, just digging through documentation over time is performance advisors. So MongoDB Atlas does offer this. There's a few advisors that it gives. It does caveat it and say, these are suggestions based on automation. You need to test this, make sure it's right. But they do give you suggestions for how to implement performance improvements, and that is missing currently from Percona monitoring and management. But you do get replica set metrics, cluster metrics, real-time metrics, CPU, disk, I/O, operating system, everything. So you shouldn't miss any of that visibility in Percona monitoring and management versus Atlas. Going further with PMM and Atlas, you do get alerting with third-party integrations. So things like PagerDuty, you could send alerts to. Percona monitoring and management is extendable. You can add other database types to it. So you can add MySQL, you can add Couchbase. There's a lot of extendability and plugins available. It is customizable as well. You can change dashboards, you can remove them, you can give people custom dashboards that have the things relevant to them that they want to see. If you want to give a networking guy login access, they can see all the networking information. PMM does have an agentless option as well. On the Atlas side, you pretty much have to deploy everything through Atlas. PMM has an option to just kind of remotely monitor without having deployed it through PMM. Another advantage of PMM is that you're using the same deployment method on-prem or cloud and have the option to deploy to any cloud provider. We don't lock that down. On the Atlas side, they've specifically targeted AWS, GCP, and Azure, which are the three major cloud providers, but you can only choose those if you go with Atlas. So here's a PMM kind of under the covers, what it looks like. From a user perspective, you just need to worry about installing PMM server. All those components underneath the hood will be designed to be working out of the box, as well as the client side, which would be installed on the host to communicate back to the PMM server. And there's a screenshot on the right of an example dashboard. Again, as the last slide said, these are completely customizable. You can add, you can remove, you can change. So this was just to give you some idea of what that would look like if you are familiar with the Atlas interface. So the last one that is important in terms of functionality is automation. So for this, the purposes of this, I'm comparing Percona Kubernetes operator for Percona Server for MongoDB with MongoDB Enterprise Advanced and Atlas. The reason I keep pulling Atlas into this is that's MongoDB's clear path forward. They're Atlas, Atlas, Atlas. When they have their shareholder talks, since they're public now, they're talking about how 70% of their users are on Atlas. They're investing heavily in that, and they're building all their automation, monitoring, alerting into that. So on the Percona side, we're trying to follow the philosophy of right tool for right job. So if you need that heavy automated focus, we recommend Kubernetes with microservices environment. What you would be giving up going the Percona route would be a GUI-based automation platform. Currently, that doesn't exist. We are working on a DBaaS that will be open source. That's in preview mode right now, but it's not available yet. So that's why that's a no for us now. Automated cloud provisioning. Currently, there's no Percona tool that automatically spins up your EC2 instances and installs Percona Server for MongoDB on them. So you would have to spin up those EC2 instances and then install the Percona Kubernetes operator for Percona Server for MongoDB after that. But we do have automated cluster provisioning, which Atlas provides, automated upgrades and patching, which Atlas also provides, and then automated backups and automated recovery. All of that is available with the Kubernetes operator for Percona Server for MongoDB. So looking a little behind the scenes, I wanted to show this to highlight that on the left is the Percona method for developing our operator. We want to develop all of the logic necessary to run a stable, performant MongoDB cluster within the operator itself. On the MongoDB side, they're leveraging what they've built over years. So that logic already exists in Ops Manager. So the enterprise operator is calling that logic from Ops Manager to handle, the automated backups, automated recovery, automated upgrades, and ops manager is handling the bulk of that and then giving acknowledgement back to the operator. So there is additional component to consider with that solution. So let's get into a cost comparison. For the purposes of this, I use the pricing available on MongoDB's website for Atlas. I use the pricing available on the AWS website for the simple monthly calculator. I used identical CPU, memory, and storage. I didn't do any bundled upfront savings. I did compare 3-node cluster deployments, but no other costs were considered, support or architecture, anything like that. So it's just apples for apples, 3-node cluster. The blue line here is MongoDB's pricing for Atlas. The orange line is just the AWS infrastructure. Because Percona software is free, that includes running Percona Server for MongoDB on it. So you can see there's quite a delta, and that M60 and M50 size, which I think probably most people would fall into, that's 8 cores at the 60 and then 4 cores at the 50. And you can see that's where kind of the greatest deltas exist. And, you know, if you multiply this out to multiple clusters, you're seeing, 40,000 with 1 cluster, 80,000 with 2 clusters, 120,000 delta with 3 clusters. So it adds up quickly over time. So it is something to consider as you begin deploying. The first deployment, 30,000 might seem like a decent investment. We're getting all this automation. But as you scale that over time, it starts to, linearly and exponentially increase cost over time. And important note at the bottom here, none of these include commercial support. Most organizations are going to want commercial support. They're going to want to reach out to a vendor who's capable of bug fixes, helping in emergencies, things like that. This is not included. So you're already paying a pretty big premium, and Mongo does provide basic support, which their website says entitles you to chat with support. All right, so summary, everything we just talked about. So from that first section where I'm comparing, the business philosophies, I think choosing a database technology is a business decision as much as a technical one. You should be considering both implications. You're choosing a partner and a database technology. The second one, enterprise open source alternatives to MongoDB exist. When you start looking around on MongoDB's website, it's not clear that their alternatives exist. It seems like that's the way to go, and that's the only option, and nothing else really should be considered. But that's not true, and hopefully I've shown you that through these past few slides. Percona Server for MongoDB has many of the same features as MongoDB Enterprise without any license cost. There are a few gaps, which I've identified and highlighted, but for the most part, you're getting a lot of the functionality that's built into Enterprise with no license cost. The fourth one is migration is easy. From the build process, you saw we're just pulling down community version, adding our features and enhancements over top. So it is a true drop-in replacement. You could have Percona Server running in a same replica set with community version. We do have some webinars on converting to Percona Server for MongoDB. If this is of interest, I would recommend searching for that. I would like to thank you for coming to my talk. Hopefully this was helpful. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can also read my blogs. I have more information and more comparisons of MongoDB. It is a topic I'm very interested in and talk about a lot. So I would love to hear from you. Thanks.